Hello, my name is Brian Warnick. I'm Associate Editor for Educational Theory. Educational Theory is a journal dedicated to exploring educational questions in all their complexity, their moral, epistemic, and aesthetic complexity. Today, I'm joined by Ellis Reid, who is at Harvard University and who recently published an article, Democracy, Justice, and School Closures, which was published in June 2021. There, Ellis makes the argument that racial stigmatization plays a role in school closures, and this role has not been adequately recognized in policy debates. So I was intrigued by this article when I first read it, and I wanted to get Ellis here for a conversation for a long time now. Ellis, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be interested in this topic.
My name is Ellis. I am a graduate student at Harvard Grad School of Education, and I first started thinking about school closures in part because I was interested in thinking about questions of school governance. So questions about how authority over the education of young people should be shared. In part too, because as I think a lot of folks who follow education policy and education debates in the US have seen, as school closures have become increasingly used as a policy lever for achieving various ends, from balancing local school budgets to promoting educational equality. We've seen a lot of these communities affected by closures, real resistance to closures, and a real significant resistance, even in some instances, multiple times, hunger strikes. And that level of resistance by citizens across the country just grabbed my interest. Chicago in particular, I'm from Chicago, went to public schools there for part of my educational career, and that was the site of one of the sort of largest single-year closures of schools in 2013. And so I think that was another thing that sort of brought me into thinking about school closures and thinking about what it means to understand them as an educational justice.
So tell us a little bit about your argument. What is it that you argue about school closures in your article?
So what I try to argue is that whereas a lot of scholars who have looked at school closures have primarily been empirical researchers motivated by real normative commitments, and I think a real strong ethical intuitions about school closures. A lot of the research has been more empirical, and so what I'm trying to do is take a specifically normative lens to looking at things, looking at this issue of school closures. And what I argue is that, drawing in particular on some work by Elizabeth Anderson in Narrative integration, and some work by Professor Eddie Glaude Jr. In Democracy in Black, try to make the case that what we should focus on when we're thinking about the injustice of school closures is the discourse and the sort of policy process that leads to school closures. I argue, following Anderson, that we have good reason to think that racially stigmatizing ideas about, in particular, Black Americans and Latinx Americans as well, shape the policy process in ways that should really trouble us, that lead to more punitive, harsher outcomes than otherwise would be the case because they trigger negative interpretive frames. And I try to make that argument and try to then show, okay, if we take that seriously, if we take seriously the idea that these racially stigmatizing ideas trigger these negative interpretive frames, what should we do? What does that tell us, or what does that lead us to think needs to be done? And then try from there to make the case that what we ought to do is to think seriously. We here as education scholars, but also I think citizens broadly, policymakers, all of us, to think seriously about what the value of the school is and what schools contribute to the flourishing of young people. I think that a dominant view is that schools are just places where kids learn things, where they get grades on math, science, social studies, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what the value of school is. Schools are more valuable insofar as they do that better. And that is important. Those things matter. But I think what a lot of those fighting school closures in their communities are trying to draw our attention to is that that's not the extent of schools' value, that they have value to the community, that they have value to students beyond those narrow academic contributions that they make. And certainly there are theorists who've made cases like that before. You could probably date it in different ways. John Dewey has a famous essay, The School of Social Center, right? It's not a new idea, but what I think is true is that there is some risk in rushing too quickly to romantic appeals to community and saying, well, schools are these great community centers, and that should be recognized, and we should therefore be really hesitant to close schools because they serve as these community hubs. I think there's more to be said about the ways in which schools contribute to the flourishing of young people that tries to avoid moving too quickly to seeing an identity of interest among all people within a particular community. We should center the flourishing of young people. That's important. The academics matter too, but we should start to think about I think we need to think more about, and in some ways be led by some of, I think, the folks who are fighting school closures on the ground, think about the ways that schools beyond those academic contributions support flourishing and future life prospects of young people, and that's a serious project, a serious undertaking that requires some real thought. So that's, I think, in a nutshell, the case I try to make.
I love how you approach the issue from both a moral dimension and how you try to expand our thinking about the nature and purposes of schooling. So those are two projects that I think that are really important in the article. Who do you hope reads this article, and what impact do you hope that it has?
That's a good question. My first thought was anybody. If I can get a few dozen reads, that would be great. Yeah, I mean, I think in part, I am writing it with an audience, folks in mind, made up of people who do educational theory work, scholars of education. So that is one audience in part, because I think, as I was saying, again, I think there's work to be done in thinking about the various ways that schools support the well-being of young people. That expands beyond, these more narrow, often academically focused contributions. Thinking about the ways that the flourishing young people is bound up with the well-being of their communities and other members of their community, and how schools mediate those relationships and support that. So I think that's one project, and that is, addressing, I think, educational theorists. I think too that I'm not certain that they'll be reading it, but I think I would love if policymakers read it as well. I mean, I think that there is real value in policymakers thinking seriously about some of these normative questions. And, we've seen some good work by folks like Harry Brickhouse and Adam Swift come to mind, writing with Helen Lattis and Anna Loeb, community goods, people trying to engage and write in a way that can really engage policy audiences and broader audiences beyond those who maybe identify as specifically with policy education. So that would be another group of folks that I'd love to have read the article as well.
Is there any future work that you see growing out of this area? What still needs to be done here?
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably a lot. There's probably still a lot of thinking you need to do there. Right now I'm working on some projects that try to think through questions of school governance, thinking about this is the question I'm sort of borrowing from Amy Gutman, but I think I go in slightly different directions that she does with it. Who should share authority over the education of young people, and how should we distribute, how should that authority be organized? I think that that's a question that is really worth paying careful attention to. And it's one, I think, that bears on the work that I started in this essay in ed theory, because in important respects, how we answer that question is bound up in what we think about the aims of education, what we think about what the schools ought to be doing. And so those two things are deeply connected to each other. So that's, I think, one area. I'm thinking about sort of the broadly called the ethics of school governance is one area that I think is related to this. So yeah, that's at least one place where I'd like to go and think more about this work.
Well, Ellis, fantastic. This is a great article. I hope people go read it. We'll link to it in the description of this video. And Thanks for joining us, and thank you for your important work on this topic. And I do hope it leads to a more nuanced discussion of school closures moving forward. So thanks again.
Thank you. It was great talking with you.